Okay, this is like part one, I guess. What's your name, stranger?
My name is Bill Scott. I'm a television writer, an actor, and producer. I'm president of the ASIFA Hollywood chapter of the International Animated Film Society.
He's the voice of a moose from Minnesota, the voice of a Mountie from Canada, and the voice of George from the jungle?
Oh! The show that I really watched was George of the Jungle, and I loved that show. I watched it almost every morning, before school.
I was very aware of Bill Scott because he was the one I couldn't put my finger on. I knew who Don Messick was. I knew who Daws Butler was. I became accustomed to hearing the types of characters that they did.
You've heard his voice, but you probably haven't heard his name.
Bill Scott.
Bill Scott.
Bill Scott.
Bill Scott.
Bill Scott.
Bill Scott.
This is Bill Scott, of whom you may have heard so little.
Anybody who made an impact in animation, influences, inspires, there's no question Bill Scott was a super talent.
As Frank Welker puts it, how does one imagine what a human being might look like who also happens to be a talking moose, a Mountie, a genius dog, and many, many more imaginative characters? This 6-foot mustached, bi-speckled gentleman with grey salt and pepper hair, a warm smile, and a definitive mischievous twinkle in his eye provided his vocal cords to some of TV's most famous cartoon characters.
Most people's impression of Bullwinkle is, "Hey, Rocky!" Do, like a complete moron. He's not a moron, he's a simpleton.
I feel like he's a guy who didn't overthink it. He didn't take it too seriously, but he brought so much nuance to the art form and set a pretty high bar for the rest of us.
This project has been put together over the past year, going through photos, videos, and archive material to piece all of this together.
He taught me to drive in the 1957 Corvette he bought in about 1960, I guess it was, when he started making some money. I think he had to put in 3 clutches while I drove that car. I wasn't great with it.
I did see a lot of Rocky and Bullwinkle. I loved it. I mean, it's so funny because his character was so different. You know what I mean? It's just that you just would not think of that when you're working with this, who played kind of a gruff guy,
The sense of humor, I think would not be too out of place today, because I think a lot of the people doing comedy now were kind of weaned on the old Rocky and Bullwinkle shorts. So I think that that DNA is now part of a lot of the people that make up our comedy community today.
Featuring interviews from people who've worked with him, stories, memories, and more. Showcasing the voice range and capability of this man has been remarkable. This is a look at the career of Bill Scott, the portrait of a moose. William John Scott was born on the 2nd of August 1920 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to William Alexander Scott and Reba Hamilton. The Scott family later moved to Trenton, New Jersey, when Bill was 5 years old. At the age of 15, he actually discovered that he had contracted tuberculosis, and in 1936, the family moved to Denver, Colorado, where they had the best treatment for it. Bill's father was a machinist, and his mother was a waitress at the famous Brown Palace.
They were living in Trenton at the time. There's a lot of the family located in Philadelphia or Trenton. There's a lot of families still there. My grandmother and grandfather both came from fairly large families. Anyway, my grandfather had a sister and a brother and a wife. My grandmother was his second wife, but he had a sister and a brother and wife, all died of tuberculosis. So when my dad got tuberculosis, they said to the doctor, where's the best place for treatment? And they said, well, most people go up to the Poconos. And my grandfather said, no, that's where my people went. They went up to the Poconos and they died. Where's the best place? And they said, well, the best treatment is in Denver. And so this is in 1936, in the depths of the Depression, and they cut stakes and moved to Denver. My grandfather wound up working in a small machine shop, and my grandmother was a waitress at the Brown Palace Hotel. Remember, he said, and it may be much like he said to me once about his father, if you want to know what my dad was like, here I am. He thought he was very much like his father. I think I'm very much like him.
I've been an animation buff since I was 4 years old. I can remember the first cartoon that I ever saw and the first gag in the first cartoon that I ever saw. It was a Felix the Cat. I was entranced by the fact that this little black thing ran across the screen. In those days, of course, all silent film, and in order for a character to show any kind of reaction, he would do what they did in comic strips, which was to have exclamation points or question marks or other punctuation over his head. And Felix, being pursued by a dog, stopped, turned, did a take, and a large exclamation point appeared over his head. He grabbed the downstroke of the exclamation point in one hand and used it as a bat to hit the period, which acted as a ball and knocked the dog out.
Bill attended South High School in Denver, and in his spare time keenly studied animation.
I had very little professional education in the field that I'm now operating in. I graduated from the University of Denver in 1941 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in theater and dramatic art and a minor in English, but what I was actually trained for was to be a school teacher. And it took me about one semester to find out that that is not the way that I wanted to spend the rest of my life. And so that was the end of my teaching career.
He then built a formidable resume as a freelance radio performer, working at local stations KOA, KLZ and KVOD.
When I just graduated from college with a drama major from the University of Denver, and a fellow who's also an animation buff in Denver named Bill Turnbull and I started working together, teaching ourselves to animate. I was really trying to teach myself to animate when World War II intervened, and I became a photographer for the Air Force, that being one of my hobbies.
You're inside the planes taking pictures of...
That was the theory anyway. Yeah. That's what I trained.
I just saw that the other day in a Spencer Tracy movie.
Yeah, I was trained to be an aerial photographer.
When he was 18, he joined the Denver Children's Theatre, where he met his future wife, Dorothy Williams. They married 4 years later. He then volunteered for a job during World War II. Originally, he was meant to be part of a combat camera crew in Culver City, but he was dashed while he was training in Colorado because they required that all combat personnel test at 20/20 vision uncorrected. He met Commanding Officer Rudy Ising, who was a part of Harman Ising, the company who did the first Looney Tunes cartoon and several others at MGM. Rudy got Bill transferred to becoming a gopher in the animation department instead, where he washed cells. He served in the US Army's first motion picture unit, reporting to the one and only Ronald Reagan, where he worked with veteran animators from MGM and Disney.
When I was assigned to the first motion picture unit animation section, I thought I had died and gone to heaven because all the people who had just been names to me were sitting at the next desks, doing much better work than I was.
Paul led this conversation. They were talking about, Ronald Reagan was now president, and he was despised by actors of a certain age who remembered what he did when he was president of Screen Actors Guild.
It was at this unit where Bill had a close relationship to famous animator Frank Thomas. A film Bill worked on was called Camouflage, and Frank suggested he try out for the auditions, as he got him into voice acting rather than drawing. This is the earliest known footage of Bill's voice acting work and presumably his first job, which dates back to 1943. When he was transferred to the unit, it was under the vague heading of intelligence, but since his squad had already been and gone, his arrival was delayed by his appearance in a play at Colorado Springs and a furlough, he wound up being permanent there. This is where he met Bill Hertz, who would go on to spend 25 years at J. Ward Productions. After the war, although he worked in a unit alongside one of Disney's 9 old men, he struggled to get a kickstart in Hollywood.
And got my first job recommended by Phil Monroe at Warner Brothers. I worked at Warner Brothers as a co-writer with Lloyd Turner. Lloyd Turner is now, I think, producer of The Jeffersons, and he's a very knowledgeable and fun guy to work with.
Turner once recalled about Bill, "When I became an apprentice writer, I was teamed with Bill Scott. He was so bright, he could draw like mad, and he was a funny guy. He taught me an awful lot. What a great guy. I couldn't think of anyone better to learn the business with than Bill Scott."
Did you work on Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny?
Never worked on a Bugs Bunny. Worked on a couple of Daffies. I was working for the Artie Davis unit at the time, and their two characters were two little chipmunks, or gophers rather, goofy gophers, who were we conceived as an Alphonse and Gaston team. You first, no you, I insist, that kind of thing. And no, I never did get to work with Elmer Fudd or a Bugs Bunny. Daffy, yes. Lloyd and I started out as Prentice Storymen as a team. We didn't know it, but we were in competition with each other. The deal was that you went 3 months at one salary, and then 3 months at the next salary, and 3 months at another salary, and then you became a journeyman, which gave you a big raise in pay. And Warner Brothers was not willing to pay two journeymen, so we were pitted against each other, each of us to do a story, and whoever's story was best was kept on, and it wasn't mine. So Lloyd was kept on, and I was bounced.
In 1947, Bill and Dorothy Scott welcomed their first child, a son named John. In the same year, he went to Paramount to work on a show called Speaking of Animals, which his future co-star June Foray did voices for. In early 1948, Bill wanted to make his wish of acting on Broadway come true. So he, Dorothy and John packed their bags and set off for New York. Sadly, this was not meant to be, and they moved back to the West Coast 6 months later. 2 years after the birth of their first child, Dorothy gave birth to a second child, their first and only daughter, named Barbara. In the same year, Bill received a phone call from Charles Shows. He was working on a new show called Time for Beanie.
I think the next thing I picked up on was writing Time for Beanie, when Time for Beanie was a live TV puppet show starring Stan Freberg and Daws Butler. And another writer, Charlie Shows, and I wrote the show for somewhere between 6 months and a year. And that was writing 15 minutes a day material. Well, that was pretty fascinating. It was Bob Clampett's show, but fortunately for all of our sanity, Clampett really never did very much on the actual production. Bob would show about, half an hour before showtime and scuttle into the booth, and he would be there throughout the show, and then right after the show he would scuttle out again. So we didn't see very much of Bob.
When we were on the show, we were making very, very little money. I was back to $60 a week, and Charlie was making the same. Stan and Daws were the heroes. They were the big guys. They were making $100 a week. In fact, Time for Beanie was one of Jay Ward's influences for Crusader Rabbit. This was before Jay and Bill's worlds crossed paths, though.
I think one Beanie story went on for, it seemed like 2 or 3 months before it ever came to a conclusion. The search for the two-headed Freep was the one that I came in on. And one of the reasons the story of the two-headed Freep lasted so long is that we couldn't find an ending for it. We had to finally discover the two-headed Freep, and two-headed Freep was unusual because most Freeps have 3 heads. But nobody could figure out what the two-headed Freep looked like, and so we kept stalling the ending, trying to figure out what a two-headed Freep would look like.
The big hassle came because at the time we were doing that, we were also working on a second television series to be called Buffalo Billy, and I was drawing characters for that. Charlie Shows is a wonderful story. I drew characters all the time. I wouldn't like him. I'd toss him in the wastebasket. Charlie came back late one night because he'd forgotten something, walked into our office, and there was Clampett pulling the drawings out of the wastebasket and putting copyright Bob Clampett on them and saving all the discards, after hours. That was a real Clampett story.
Next Monday morning, the rest of the gang was called to a breakfast at Armstrong Schroeder to talk about future plans. I was not invited, and when Freberg says, "Well, where's Bill?" Clampett flipped his glasses and said, "Well, Bill isn't with us anymore." So that was the end of my stint with Clampett. But it was an exciting time.
That was it. His attorney had called me up and said, "Bob is going to be handling the writing of the new show himself, and he won't need your services anymore." When I talked to Stan and Daws and Charlie afterward, I got the same story from all of them. I talked to Bob 2 years ago, and he said to me, "Gee, Scotty, I haven't seen you in years." And I said, No, the last time you saw me, you fired me. Oh ho ho ho. Well, I'll tell you about that. And he told me about that. Bill's next big move was in 1950, where he joined UPA, United Productions of America. This is where he began to get recognition for his writing skills. He wrote shorts like Rooty Toot Toot and several Mr. Magoo shorts.
Again, I was recommended there by Bill Hertz, whom I'd worked with in the first motion picture unit. And again, was teamed up with another writer, Phil Eastman. And our first job was the second Magoo picture. They had already made one picture called Ragtime Bear, and Magoo seemed to be a viable character, and Phil and I were given the task of doing the next Magoo picture, and we did, I think, the next 3 Magoos.
It all starts with the script, really. And I think the Magoos were beautifully done. The script was great. And then the acting. I mean, Jim Backus's voice as Mr. Magoo. It was perfect.
16, please.
When asked by Jim Corkis if writing at UPA was different to writing at Warner's, he replied, "The kiss of death at UPA was to be considered a Warner Brothers writer. They were considered clothesline gag people with lots of violence. At UPA, you had to be able to justify your humour, which was difficult to do. You couldn't write a big blow-off for your joke and pay it off with a big animation tag or a pose." He helped adapt Dr. Seuss's original story for the 1950 Academy Award-winning short Gerald McBoing Boing, which later became a television show, as well as adapting the 1953 short film of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which was a favourite of his to work on.
Ted Geisel, Dr. Seuss, was known, was a good friend of the people at UPA, and he had this record that the great Gildersleeve had made of a poem, the Gerald McBoing Boing. And he sold it to UPA as a great idea for an animated cartoon, except that they ran into this little problem, which was that what you were dealing with was sound. Animation is a visual medium. So what do you do? How does it wind up? What's the big ending? How does it work out? The series, I guess the other memorable one that's been playing for a while was A Telltale Heart, which Fred Grable and I worked on, adapting to the animation medium and running a narration, which was very interesting to tell that whole story. And I think we had 6 minutes at the time, when Poe didn't write it that way at all, and Poe had no ending to his story. So again, it was a matter of adapting.
When asked if he had a favourite UPA short, he responded, "I guess if I were limited to one to look at over and over again, it would be The Telltale Heart. I worked with Fred Gable on that one. It was my job to adapt the Edgar Allan Poe story. I'd pick a phrase here and there and write Poe-like stuff to bridge the gaps. Ted Parmalee and Paul Julian really did a superb job." The primary challenge was to do something that wouldn't start to get laughs right away. It was very tough. We also had to reduce, in a normal film speed, the way that, say, a live-action film can progress. We're dealing with a 20 to 25 minute story. We had to compress that into a very, very short period of time. Much of what was actually in The Telltale Heart was not written by Poe, but simply in the style of Poe. Originally planned for release in 3D, this short was narrated by actor James Mason and was very successful. It is currently unknown if the 3D shots are still around. He didn't just write at UPA though. As well as writing for this short, Bill voice acted as BJ Bendover in Pete Hothead in 1952.
Yes. Throw this driveling idiot out! Lavery, you've handled this abominably.
No, BJ, I only was
No
asking.
excuses. You're through. Stop groveling, Lavery. Now, back to the bundle department.
In the same year, he played characters in the short Man Alive alongside his wife.
Ed, what's that noise?
Noise? What noise? Oh, for crying out loud, lay off, will you? I don't... Oh, what a knucklehead I've been. Oh, why didn't I get down here weeks ago? Oh, boy, no more worrying.
I always liked to act. I was radio actor in Denver. I never made much money at it, but I was always available. And I did a couple of national broadcasts from Denver, doing various cowboys. I did a whole series of Air Force programs out of Lowry Field.
Scott was then caught in the blacklist fallout. He was then laid off by UPA in the Red Scare because his writing partner was fired for leftist activities. He was disgusted that the management of UPA was forcing a few people to leave in order to save the company from being attacked by right-wing groups.
Nobody will ever know the true story of the folding of UPA. But it had to do, in large part, with the political background of some of the guys who were the founders and wheels there. Well, nobody was supposed to get fired for that reason, you see, because there was nothing illegal about what he had done. It was just what these people said. So they fired me too. They fired Eastman and me on the grounds that they did not need that story unit.
Some were fired and some resigned. I don't know what happened to the others. Some very important figures. Hubley was among them. Bill then went freelancing before going to work at John Sutherland Productions in 1955.
I left UPA under somewhat of a cloud and went to work for John Sutherland Productions. And John Sutherland was specialized in producing animated cartoons for industrial and commercial enterprises. Did some early TV commercials, but really got most of his stuff doing propaganda films for big business. And that's what I did for 4 years.
He created the storyline for Destination Earth along with George Gordon and Michael Amesto. He describes Sutherland's films as mostly propaganda messages for right-wing sponsors, including the stock exchange and the oil industry. He said that he couldn't relate to the messages, but the studio paid the staff well. Bill also co-wrote the industrial short It's Everybody's Business. He also wrote Horizons of Hope, The Propaganda Cartoon King, and Fred Finchley's Stylized World.
One thing that was interesting was during the time I worked at John Sutherland, he had hired a storyman by the name of Bill Scott as part of the operation. And Bill was a very funny guy, and we said, kid around a lot.
It was a well-paid job, but he didn't enjoy writing conservative propaganda.
Play a game, Bill and I, called Whatever Happened To, which would drive everybody crazy in the place, because we'd be at it, whatever happened to, and we name an actor who had long since passed from view. And, it was like a lot of fun with him.
I wouldn't say that either my social or political feelings were shaped one way or the other by my stint at Sutherland. Everything that I had thought or suspected about big business turned out to be absolutely true. And I just could not deal with it after a while. That's the only job I ever quit. Fortunately, I was fired from everything else.
But the company weren't buying it and kept claiming he was fired. As he recalled, I kept trying to tell them I quit, but they kept stuffing my mouth with money.
So after Sutherland, I went back to UPA for a bit, worked on the late lamented McBoing Boing show for CBS. It got about halfway through that enormous enterprise, and somebody suddenly realized that nothing was funny that was coming out. Everything was very artistic and everything was very inventive and the graphics were sensational, but there were no jokes. So somebody, I don't know who it was, prevailed upon Bob Cannon, who had never been a very big fan of mine anyway, to ask me in as his assistant to try to inject some humor or some point of view or some satire or some zip into the stuff that was coming out. I did my best, but it really never did get off the ground.
In 1956, Bill and Dorothy welcomed their third and final child, a son named Robert, who sadly passed away in 2008.
How many children do you have?
Well, I have three. I have one who's my oldest boy, John, is a public defender with LA County, and my girl is a musician in Santa Cruz, and my younger boy, Rob, is trying to be a musician.
How old is he now?
He's 21.
So you have three.
Yeah, and the oldest one's 30.
My brother was kind of a vagabond. He did some very interesting things. He was He drove a bus in Denali National Park. He helped train Lipizzano stallions in Florida. He played in a band in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And the problem was that in doing all that stuff, he didn't take very good care of himself.
Bill went back to UPA in 1959 to work on their Mr. Magoo production of 1001 Arabian Nights, which also featured Hans Conried.
He was not there when I first started, but he came back. This probably would have been in 58. Whenever we were in production on Arabian Nights, he came in and was dialogue supervisor.
The film's director, Jack Kinney, hired Bill to be the sound director for it, so he directed all the voice artists' dialogues for the film, and even played some minor roles himself. He was then contacted by Charlie Shows, who was about to write for Hanna-Barbera's first cartoon, Rough and Ready.
After that, I freelanced for a year or two, writing commercials for Storyboard, Quartet, did a couple of pictures for Walter Lantz when he was working for the State Department, and it was while I was freelancing that I got a call from Charlie Shows, who I worked with on the time for Beanie, and he had met a fellow named Jay Ward. Jay had produced Crusader Rabbit, and then, not being able to sell another show, he had gone back into the real estate business in Berkeley. Alex Anderson began to work for an advertising agency, later had his own agency, so they were pretty much out of it. And a producer in New York named Seamus Culhane got very interested in producing a TV series, and he wanted to produce it on the West Coast.
So Jay and Charlie Shows and I met, and we talked over a series to be called Phineas Fox. And then it dropped into the great beyond.
It was at this company that Bill Scott and Jay Ward would first meet. Jay Ward previously worked with a man named Alex Anderson on a show named Crusader Rabbit, which was the first ever animated cartoon series made for television.
How did Rocky and Bullwinkle get started?
Well, Bill can answer that.
They actually started as two supporting characters on somebody else's show. When Jay originally did Crusader Rabbit.
Jay Ward, of course.
Jay Ward did Crusader Rabbit with a partner named Alex Anderson. Brilliant writer, a wonderful artist. And they tried to get a series to follow up Crusader Rabbit. The networks and stations and all the powers that be knew that this was never going to work on television at all, so they didn't buy any of the.
Were you involved with Crusader Rabbit?
No. I came in very late in the game. I came in 1958. Crusader Rabbit was about 10 years earlier than that. But one of the series that Jay and Alex Anderson dreamed up was a series called The Frostbite Falls Follies. And it was about the adventures of a bunch of animals who have a television station in the North Woods. Two of the supporting characters in this were a moose and a squirrel. And Jay fell in love with the moose and the squirrel, I suppose, because they were very much like the rabbit and the tiger in Crusader Rabbit. So we were together on another project, and he asked me about a year later if I thought I could write an adventure strip with a moose and a squirrel. Never having written one, I said, of course we can write an adventure strip with a moose and a squirrel. And that's
flying
how we
squirrel,
started.
no less.
Jay seemed to love the whole big guy teams up with a little guy concept, because in this show there was a little squirrel named Rocky and a big moose named Bullwinkle, named after Clarence Bullwinkle, a car dealer near Berkeley, California, where Jay lived. They decided to base a show just around Rocky and Bullwinkle, and thus the duo's name was born. A script was written which became the pilot film for Rocky and His Friends.
No, I did that pilot in 58 when I was still at UPA. And then it took about a year or more to get it sold and hire me away from there.
June Foray was the voice of Rocky the Flying Squirrel and Natasha Fatale. Paul Frees was the voice of Boris Badenoff, and William Conrad was cast as the narrator.
My agent called me one day and said, have you ever heard of a Jay Ward? And I had never even heard of Crusader Rabbit, frankly. But anyway.
Peasant.
He said, darling, he wants to take you to lunch. So I said, well, what does he want besides that? He said, well, he's got an idea for a show, and he'd like to take you to lunch. And here is an actress who all her life has had to voice test for everything, you know.
At the time, there was only like 6 people doing voiceover, you know, and Bill Scott was half of them, you know, and there was Bill Scott and, like I say, Paul Frees. There just weren't that many people doing it.
When we recorded the pilot, we were in a little recording studio. Here is June Foray, one of the finest voice actresses in the world. Here is Paul Frees, who was the voice of everybody. and there is me. They were all very successful radio actors.
But there was only one voice missing.
So they were down to, well, who's going to do Bullwinkle?
Jay, who are you going to cast for the Moose?
And Bill had just done a masterful job of reading the thing.
Well, I said, who's going to play, who should we get to play Bullwinkle?
And he said, well, I thought you were doing it. And apparently that was how he was cast in that role.
Oh, well, I was just filling in. I thought you'd cast like a real actor for it. So, no, you're it.
And boy, did that start things off, because they got big residual money.
Bill would say that when Jay told him he would do the voice of Bullwinkle, his first thought was, well, at least I'll get $50 for the session.
Heavens to Eliza, he's a little fuzzy comet!
Now what is wrong? I thought I'd get it in.
Heavens to Eliza, he's a little fuzzy comet!
When I was a kid, there was a fellow named Red Skelton, and he had a TV show, and he had a character named Clem Cadiddlehopper. And Clem Cadiddlehopper sounded like this.
We got this letter from Red Skelton's attorney, and he said, Mr. Skelton feels that you have stolen his voice of Clem Cadiddlehopper to use for Bullwinkle. You will cease and desist, or we will take legal action.
I remember seeing Bill Scott on an interview show once, and they were saying to him, now, you know, Bill, a lot of people say that that Bullwinkle is kind of a loner from Red Skelton's, Clem Cadiddlehopper.
And on that night, the puppet goes on the air, and he says, see, we get a letter in the mail today from Mr. Red Skelton. He said that my voice sounds like that of Clem Cadiddlehopper. Now, to show you just how silly that is, I will now do my imitation of Clem Cadiddlehopper. Hi there, this is Clem Cadiddlehopper speaking. Now, you see how different? We didn't hear anything more.
The first episode of the Jet Fuel Formula storyline went on air in black and white on the 19th of November 1959 on ABC.
The first shows were all animated in Mexico. I knew nothing about this, as a matter of fact, until the day we were to sign the contracts. We would send the storyboards to Mexico City. The gentlemen who were instrumental in putting the show together bracketed me like two tame elephants and the rogue elephant, and they said, if you hear us say anything about Mexico, say we can do it.
Jay and Bill also came up with the name Ponsonby Brit. He supposedly gained an OBE title and became the executive producer of the show. In fact, he was entirely fictional. Bill Scott was quoted as saying, we had no executive producer, so we felt we should make one up. Ponsonby even had an official biography used in press releases.
You know, I remember everything from the way Rocky sounded when he was soaring. You know, when Rocket J Squirrel was flying through the air, and watch me pull a rabbit out of a hat. And then he'd, again. Then he'd pull out a rhinoceros and go, ooh, must have been the wrong hat. And I just could, you know, and it was like these little interstitials, these little bits. And it was like a vaudeville show. It was like a variety show.
Other segments of the show included Dudley Do-Right of the Mounties, Fractured Fairy Tales, Aesop and Son, Bullwinkle's Corner, Mr. Know-It-All, and Peabody's Improbable History. Bill was the voice of Dudley, Peabody, Fearless Leader, Mr. Big, and multiple minor characters.
You look more like a dry mop. Yeah, and come to think of it, you look an awful lot like him.
Congratulations, Badenoff. You win the Pottsylvania Two-Faced Medal for double dealing.
Why don't you pick on somebody your own size? Oh, that was quite easy. I just did this in front of the light. The shadow of the gun was supposed to frighten you away.
Let's send Nell, sir.
We can't. She's not a mounted.
Then you go.
Hello again. Peabody here. And you're just in time to accompany Sherman and me on another journey into history.
This man, this dog, this beagle is really a kind of a Clifton Webb. Very clipped in his speech and everything very forward in the mouth. And so that's where the Mr. Peabody voice came from.
I just loved the adventure and the kind of educational aspect, even though as a kid you don't realize it's educational. If it was, I probably wouldn't have been watching.
I was huge into Dudley Do-Right because I'm Canadian. So, I mean, that was just a natural. You go, oh, this is really funny. They're making fun of Mounties. And, Dudley Do-Right was, well, I mean, you know all about Dudley Do-Right.
I watched it when I was probably 6 or 7 years old, around 1967. Was when I really got into it, and I watched a lot of those shows at that time.
Bill was also responsible for writing the show's scripts as well.
Obviously, he's super gifted in writing because he wrote so much of what we saw in animation. So I think he's a great writer. He's super funny. He's super aware of political climates. I think nobody, unless you know who he is and what he does, no one would say, oh, a voice actor wrote that. He was as skilled at writing as he was in acting, I believe.
I think it was hilarious. It was timely. It was clever and sarcastic. I loved everything about it.
I always like shows that are written intelligently and they don't talk down to kids. Rocky and Bullwinkle never talked down. Bill Scott's material was written for adults, but it included children and all ages. They could enjoy it no matter how old you were. You got it. And that's hard to do, is to make something palatable for the little kids and for the adults at the same time. And he was a master of that.
Writer Skip Craig had met Bill at UPA but would be reunited with him during the production of Rocky and Bullwinkle, and would go on to spend 25 years at the company. He worked on the show as a track reader. His son, Jeff Craig, got to visit his dad's workplace too. Jay Ward's offices were known for being a fun place to be.
I didn't know, I guess I never got invited to Jay's special office, or I never saw a throne chair, and there was a pool. Where was a pool? I never saw it.
At the Andalusia.
Jay and my dad had their offices around the corner from the main office on the Strip, down on Crescent Heights in a court called the Andalusia, which is why Captain Peter Peachfuzz's boat is named the Andalusia.
In 1961, the show was bought by NBC and rebranded The Bullwinkle Show.
Ever since drama first started, it's always the clowns and the villains that take over the stage. The heroes become, in essence, nice guys, but they are simply the peg on which series are done.
They held a launch party to celebrate, where Jane Mansfield would unveil what would become an iconic statue on Sunset Boulevard, a 14-foot, 7-pound statue of Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Right across the street from the office building on the Sunset Strip, the big billboard for a casino in Las Vegas. And on top of the billboard was a statue of a showgirl holding a cowboy hat.
There must have been, it's hard to estimate, 2,000 or 3,000 people maybe. And there was a bandstand on the corner. There was a savings loan right across from our building on Havenhurst. And they built a big bandstand over there. There was a 20-piece band playing music that had been scored, a tracking library of stuff for Fractured Flickers. And so they were playing the arrangements of all this legit Jay Ward music. And then he had, of course, balloon guys and giving away hats over by the statue for the actual unveiling. Sunset Boulevard was clogged. They left one traffic lane open. I guess a cop was maybe letting them through from each end. So they had a big sign saying, "Don't complain, we'll get this lane closed too."
Like Sid Grauman did at the Grauman's Chinese Theater, they had little places where you could make your imprinted cement at the base of the Bullwinkle statue. Instead of handprints, they'd have people put in elbow prints. And they faked one for Walt Disney, except his elbow print was square.
The Rocky and Bullwinkle statue has been repainted a few times since the unveiling, but in 2019 it was announced that after being neglected in storage for years, the statue would be put back on Sunset Boulevard. The statue was meant to have another celebration to commemorate the restoration, however this was cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Jay and Bill appeared on an episode of Here's Hollywood with Helen O'Connell. However, this episode is currently lost and has not been found as of 2021. Despite the success of the show, it still managed to attract controversy.
There was one occasion on which we were taken to task Because we had used a standard, what I thought was a standard cartoon ploy, Rocky and Bullwinkle are captured by natives and they are put into a pot, right? And the fire is lit under them and the network screamed bloody murder. They said, no cannibalism on children's shows. Jay fired off a letter asking for a philosophical decision on whether it was cannibalism to eat a moose and a squirrel.
They could do the cleverest, was sociologically, politically relevant humor, and the parents would get it, and the kids would get some of the humor when they were younger, and then when they grew up, they would fully understand, the rest of the context.
The next thing they objected to was the natives themselves. They said, you can't do this, the NAACP is going to get after us. So from that point on, all of our natives were always white. We had the whitest natives.
Now, we did several episodes on the Kerwood Derby, and an announcer at that time was Durwood Kirby.
We got a letter from Durwood Kirby's attorney. He said, Mr. Kirby feels that so-and-so, and you will cease and desist, or we will be forced to take legal action. Jay wrote back a letter and said, if Mr. Kirby will sue us, we will pay his attorney's fees.
It was autumn 1962, and Jay decided to campaign to get Moosylvania statehood. Jay and publicist Howard Brandy conducted a cross-country tour in a decorated van, gathering signatures on a petition for statehood for Moosylvania.
And in one of those rare bits of timing, Jay wanted to present all the petitions at the White House. That was the idea. He was going to give the president these millions of signatures. I don't know how the hell many he had, but they were, way hundreds of thousands anyway. Give these signatures to the president.
That's when Jay and Howard Brandy hit the White House gate with the music blaring in the sound truck and demanding to see the president. We have these petitions. And Howard in his Dudley Do-Right suit was cowering in the back end of the thing. And Jay was driving, he was dealing with the guard, and the guy had his pistol snapped open and had his hand on it. And Howard says, Jay, stop. And Jay said to Howard, well, he doesn't have to be rude. And he was on the verge of getting shot or arrested.
And he drove right up to the White House. Oh, what they must have thought of him. That's so funny. It's so funny that he did that.
And so we wound up trying to crash the White House gates right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
On the subject of Rocky and Bullwinkle, a Bullwinkle puppet was made to serve as the intro for the show in 1961. Bill operated and voiced the puppet live with a hilarious combination of irreverence and self-deprecation, previously unseen in TV cartoons. The puppet was best known for making snide jokes about other companies like Disney, and even making jokes about his own broadcaster, like the time he said they cooked the NBC Peacock. On one occasion, Bullwinkle told children to pull the knobs off their television set so they wouldn't miss next week's episode. NBC were horrified when hundreds of children complied with his encouragement to do this and received hundreds of complaints from angry parents. The following week, Bullwinkle told the audience to glue the knobs back onto their television sets, but alas, the damage had already been done. The live intros were then scrapped in favour of a fully animated format. This was the segment that went live on air to hundreds of children that very day.
First, a message for all you kids who are watching. Did you know that the knobs on your television set will come off if you pull on them? Right now, why not pull off the knob that changes the channels? It's loads of fun, and that way you'll be sure to be with us next week. And the week after that, and the week after that, and the week after...
Bill was the heart and soul of the Moose. I guess you could call him Bill Winkle?
William was Bill Scott, who was the voice of Bullwinkle and the head writer for the show. And so Bill Scott, this big cheery guy with glasses and this big red face and just grinning all the time.
The puppet then appeared in an episode of Fractured Flickers in 1963, but we'll get to that very shortly. But speaking of Fractured Flickers... This show debuted in 1963 and was Jay Ward's first attempt to produce a live-action show.
I acted as, in essence, as as story editor or head writer on that particular series, I had my own responsibility. We try to do one major fracturing of a feature, take a whole feature and just boil it down to about a 5-minute thing. It had nothing to do with the original. I did most of those.
Bill Scott made some slight cuts and added a few titles and took out some things, and it's straight and really, really well done. Rich Harrison did the sound effects.
Presented by actor Hans Conried, known for playing Snidely Whiplash in Dudley Do-Right, the show featured him and a celebrity guest introducing short flickers pieced together from silent films.
They would get a hold of all this old black and white footage from the silent era that was public domain. Nobody owned the rights to it. So they would just take it and then they would dub new voices on it to make them funny.
J. Ward mainstays June Foray, Paul Frees and Bill Scott provided the voices in the flickers.
Let's see. The wing nut slips through the tie knot and Lupe folds under the hinge.
Not so good, Harry. There's 2 other experimental planes up here, and one of them is, well, I think maybe he's from Lockheed.
Granddad, how you make a bee? Granddad, it's madness. No, a robot.
These weren't Bill's only roles in the show, though. In fact, he had 3 cameos on screen. His first one was a delivery man in the Vivian Della Chiesa episode.
Hey, you the party ordered the schmaltz herring gone dry?
His second one was a stuntman in the Diana Dawes episode.
So come in. Speed risky. Watch out for that lamp.
His final one was as the Bullwinkle puppet in the Bullwinkle Moose episode. It is rumoured that this episode was filmed as a replacement for an unused guest.
How do you do, all you folks in television land? Oh, a bunch of the boys were whooping it up in the Malibu Saloon. A little bit under the weather, too. Boy, those cast parties are murder.
Cast party? You're in a show?
No. Friend of mine broke his leg. How about that one, huh?
The writers had to pick out their own shots, and then Roger was there then for that, so we did have 2 guys. We broke down the film into loops. I forget, maybe a couple hundred feet each. We didn't want to tackle too much at a time, so we make it into a loop, and that would play continuously as they recorded the dialogue.
Also in 1963, Bill provided voices in The Great Rights, a short which demonstrates what would happen if the Bill of Rights disappeared from American life.
Have you reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. We find the accused.
How can you reach a verdict without hearing the...
We find the accused.
Proceed with the verdict.
We find the accused.
What about my rights?
Denied.
In May that same year, Jay and Bill's second attempt at a live-action show came around when CBS approached them to create a fast and zany show. The Nut House was filmed in black and white and starred many comedians of its time, including Don Franks, Jane Connell, Tony Holland and more.
There were several little animated bits. Roger and I were working on those. Other than that, it was shot live and taped. Quite a time after we did it, we got a film print. It was on tape, but we got a film print. Jay always, lousy timing. The day they taped it was JFK's funeral. I think Kennedy was killed on Friday, and Al Burns had this big program all printed up, and it was full of Kennedy jokes. I heard about it down at Glen, and I went back to the studio, and I said, Al! And he came, and he redid the whole thing, got it printed for redistribution by Sunday. I don't know how. The funeral was in progress on TV all over the country as we were trying to tape this wild, crazy comedy show. Another example of Jay's luck or timing, I don't know which it was.
Unfortunately, the pilot was not successful and was not commissioned for a full series. This and Fractured Flickers would be the only live-action material that came from J. Wood Productions. In 1964, Alan Burns was writing The Munsters and offered Bill the role of Grandpa.
I remember talking with me about whether or not he should take that part, because to do so, he'd have to leave J. Ward, and he was fairly sure that if he left J. Ward, that J. Ward would not continue to exist. And he eventually decided not to leave Jay. Jay was a very generous man, and it would have been very difficult to say, well, I'm off and away. So I think that their relationship and the company was more important than the show.
He was not all that sure the show would be a success, but it actually wound up running for 72 episodes. He ultimately declined, and the part was played by vaudevillian Al Lewis. Along came the next animated J. Ward show, Hoppity Hooper.
I know that show. I remember it very well. Yeah, it was really fun.
Well, I'm certainly glad to know there is one Hoppity Hooper fan still extant.
The show starred Hans Conried as Waldo Wigglesworth and Chris Allen as the titular character. Chris was brought in as Hoppity's voice as they didn't want him to sound like Rocky. Bill played Fillmore Bear in this show.
But Professor, I don't think I'm the athletic type. Maybe we could forget about the whole thing, Professor. Where's my bugle? That was me, Hoppity.
Why did you blow your bugle at 30,000 feet, Fillmore?
Because Waldo and that big bird are right outside the window.
I loved the series, particularly since we got to work with Hans Conried, who was just a gem to work with. And again, a girl doing a boy's part, a little gal named Chris Allen, a writer who did Hoppity Hooper.
In the first 2 episodes, Fillmore was actually played by Alan Reed. These 2 episodes were recorded in 1960 as a pilot for the show.
Well, let's not cross any state lines, Professor. That's real trouble.
It didn't get sold until 4 years later. When the show got a proper series, he was replaced with Bill, as Alan then became under contract by ABC for his role as Fred Flintstone in The Flintstones. Hoppity Hooper was screened on NBC.
I like to write and I like to act. I do both of those things very well. I'm comfortable doing those. In as much as there was a head writer, I was the head writer, though I never had that title as head writer. But the joy of working with Jay was freedom. He trusted writers.
Next came George of the Jungle.
George of the Jungle, strong as he can be. Watch out for that tree.
I loved all the J. Ward shows, Rocky and Bullwinkle, Super Chicken, Tom Slick, George of the Jungle, of course.
They were very tongue-in-cheek and they were very sarcastic. And even as a kid, they just were different than most cartoons.
Of course, George was Bill Scott.
Unlike J. Ward's previous shows, this show was animated in Hollywood by veteran animators. His previous shows were animated by Gamma Productions of Mexico. The Hollywood animation was more advanced than the crude animation done by Gamma. Jay was so impressed with the show's style that he allowed production to go over budget, which sadly resulted in financial loss. The show only ran for 1 season and 17 episodes. Each episode was split into 3 segments: George of the Jungle, Tom Slick, and Super Chicken. Bill, along with the other J. Ward mainstays, was a leading cast member. He was the voice of all 3 titular characters of the segments. In an interview with Judy Wilmot, Bill revealed that he sung the theme song to all 3 segments.
District Commissioner talked just like George. District Commissioner need help? George, go.
I hope so too, Gertie. But I'll have to beat that evil guy and bad sport Baron Automatic to do it. Careful. There's no such word as careful in auto racing, Marigold. This looks like a job for Super Chicken. You get the super sauce, and I'll change into my super suit. Super.
And not forgetting Gertie Growler.
Come on, Tom. Pour on the coal, run up them RPMs, light up that afterburner, boy. Grab all them goodies.
And even when he would talk about all of the super stuff in Super Chicken, he would do that liquid U, saying Super Chicken. Those little nuances just brought the character alive for me.
However, he was not the original voice for Super Chicken, and this is not the first time the idea for Super Chicken has popped up. In 1960, a pilot was conceived where Don Knotts and Louis Nye, 2 popular comedians, were cast by Bill as Super Chicken and Fred. Bill wanted different voices from the Rocky and Bullwinkle show, and he hired Marvin Miller as the narrator. However, despite having a storyboard and a soundtrack, the pilot was never sold. The only pilot that was sold was Hoppity Hooper, which sat on the shelf until it was sold in 1964. Jay then decided to revive the Super Chicken idea, and he wanted Bill to be the voice of the titular character. By this time, Don Knotts was now very busy as a regular on the Andy Griffith Show, and it was doubtful he would have been available. Even if he was, his fee would have been a lot higher than they could afford. Despite his big appearances in these J. Ward cartoons, Bill was never credited as a cast member.
When they were doing the credits for the show,
they had a specific time, like 30 seconds or whatever it was. The first names that you saw, I think on that first series, I think it said produced by Jay Ward and Bill Scott in quite big letters. And then he didn't get a credit as a writer either, and he really was the head writer on that show.
I don't think he's ever received much recognition for it, because the only credit he took was producer, along with Jay. He was never listed in the voices.
He didn't really?
But
he didn't really?
No.
Why not?
He was fantastic.
George of the Jungle would be the last Jay Ward show for a while, as the company then mainly focused on commercials for food brands such as Crisp Quake, Aunt Jemima, Captain Crunch, King Vitamin and more.
Wobble, wobble, wobble. Wobble, 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 wobble. Wobble, wobble, wobble. Wobble, 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 wobble.
But, sire, the Blue Baron is 10 times your size. How can you possibly win?
An enormous mad ball of yarn is blocking all traffic in space.
Bill was known to a lot of people, particularly as the voice of Jean Lafoot, the enemy of Captain Crunch, who was voiced by Daws Butler.
Hello, Captain Crunch. Now, I, Jean Lafoot, challenge you to a crunching contest.
Jay Ward Productions has, for many years, been the prime producer of commercials for the Captain Crunch line of children's cereals, and I do several voices on that. Jean Lafoot, be barefoot, Jean Lafoot, and
One of the little kids, Dave, who's on the Captain Crunch's crew.
and some of those.
Where is he?
The Quaker Oats Company knocked on the door one day, and they literally did. Everybody'd gone for the day, and Frankie Jones, our secretary, was the only one who was there, and somebody called up, and they'd like to speak to somebody, and nobody was there. You say, can I help you? And they said, well, this is a Quaker Oats Company, and we'd like to know if Jay Ward would be interested in doing some commercials for us. And Frankie said, why, certainly. Jay he hated commercials. He didn't want to do commercials at all. First, to find out the thing that kids wanted most in a cereal, and then to make that the name of a character, and to make that the name of the cereal, and to tie the whole thing in and aim it just at television advertising. Well, they did some research. They found that kids like cereal to be crunchy. That was one of the big words. So they got a character, and they called it the thing Crunch. Then they got a character called Captain Crunch. And then they came to us, along with a number of other studios, I must say. And we had some going to talk Jay, even submitting a proposal. But he turned it over to Alan, who was doing all the public relations work at that time.
I think I probably first encountered him in probably 1968, which was the first year I was out here. I worked for an animator named Dwayne Crowther, and he was doing some freelancing on some Captain Crunch commercials that were going through Jay Ward's studio at the time. So I took some of the artwork. It's funny because I had, just learned to drive. I was a really green driver. But, Dwayne took advantage of having me ambulatory on wheels to take artwork over to Jay Ward's studio. And I think I saw Jay Ward and Bill Scott for the first time working in Jay Ward's office, the famous one with the television set. And they had no desk. They liked to work on top of their TV. So I think I saw both of them working on a storyboard, and Bill Hertz, one of their directors, let me in the front door, and Jay Ward took like one look out in the hallway and slammed the door.
So Al and Roy Morita spent the whole long weekend up in Jay's apartment writing commercials, sketching out storyboards. They did the whole thing and sold the thing, and which kept us working for probably 15 years. You couldn't say the words protein, energy, or something until they had poured the milk, because the only worthwhile ingredients was in the milk. The cereal was junk.
It would be these commercials that would keep Jay Ward Productions in full swing for the next decade. In fact, the final decade from 1974 to 1984 was dominated almost exclusively by Captain Crunch and his cereal spin-off friends.
But for 18 years, we've done the Captain Crunch commercials. They just changed production houses now. Maybe they're not even making Captain Crunch anymore. I don't know.
No. Residuals have dried up.
Yes, yeah. But we did those for 18 years, the whole family together.
One never knew where to find them, but they always looked wonderful when you'd see them with the most outrageous puns that you could imagine.
They'd say to Bill, write us a 30-second commercial for Captain Crunch or whatever. So he'd come in and he'd have all these scripts and he'd pass them around to everyone at the table, right? All these executives. And then he'd say, okay, we're going to read through this. And he'd say, blah, 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 blah. And then they'd do the voice and, people would chuckle and whatnot. And then somebody stopped him and said, I don't know. I don't think that's funny. You don't say to somebody who writes for a living funny things, I don't think that's funny. Bill, I think, went home and thought about this and decided, yeah, I'm not going to let this happen anymore. So he comes into the next meeting and he's got the scripts and he hands them out and they start reading and somebody stops him and says, I don't know about this word here, right? And Bill says, you're absolutely right. That's completely wrong. And he takes the page, rips it off of the stack, they're stapled together, rips it, throws it on the floor. Okay, next script. He starts reading, blah, 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 blah. Somebody stops him. He goes, you're absolutely right. That's garbage. Rip, throws it on the floor. And now they're terrified that they've alienated their sole comedy writer. And nobody said anything anymore after that.
In 1971, Bill received a letter from a young man from Australia named Keith Scott.
Oh, yeah, God, what the... Keith Scott, of course, can't think of his last name. Yes, Bullwinkle played in Australia. It was not very successful in Australia, except with Keith, and he fell apart. And he watched assiduously as it ran and ran and ran and reran in Australia. And indeed, he became the J. Ward archives, practically. He saved up his money when he was much younger, saved up his money and paid his way from Australia to Hollywood just to come to the J. Ward studio.
He was a young man who loved cartoons just like Bill when he was younger. They began to correspond back and forth with each other, revealing much more information about the production of the show, such as where the dialogue was recorded at and what time it was recorded. Keith sent Bill a detailed episode guide to the Bullwinkle show which he had been working on for months. Bill loved it so much that he actually used it in his office as reference. He copied Keith's letter and sent it to June Foray, and around the same time she met someone just like Keith. That someone was Corey Burton.
I had gotten to know Jay by visiting J. Ward Productions' little old house with Keith way back in the 70s and 80s. And I was always there because I would drive. June introduced us. Even before I met June in person, when I talked to her on the phone, she said, there's somebody in Australia who sounds a lot like you. They have the same interests, and you should be a pen pal. And God, I don't want to be a pen pal. Okay, and she insisted, and I wrote Keith a letter, and then we were pen pals immediately for years.
April 1973 rolled round, and 19-year-old Keith Scott won a competition in a local magazine, the prize being a trip to Hollywood, where he finally met his heroes. Bill took him to lunch at Frascati's restaurant just opposite J. Ward's studios, where they had a 3-hour conversation about Ward's creations. In fact, Bill predicted that one day Keith would write a book. He was flattered, but at the same time, he didn't know what to do. 17 years later, he decided to do the book. And in 2000, he published The Moose That Roared, the official biography of J. Ward and Bill Scott. Both Keith and Corey became close friends of the J. Ward Productions family and attended many recording sessions, mostly for commercials.
June, when I was just a teenager and interested in doing this for a living, she was kind enough to clear myself and a friend to recording a J. Ward recording session for these commercials for Captain Crunch cereal. The various cereals they had. And Bill Scott was there directing, and he had probably written the commercials as well. I don't know. And so, yeah. I was so impressed with him.
I remember whenever Keith and Corey got to do anything for Jay, once in a while they got to do something with June, and I remember how thrilled they both were, because when they first showed up, they were 18 or 19, just huge fans, and Keith invariably, when he got to perform something or record something with June, he was just beside himself. It was so great. They did a fairy tale. On one edition of the Dudley Do-Right DVD that came out, they included a fairy tale with it. And it was an old script that Bill had written. And June was on it, of course, as some kind of a princess. And Corey and Keith got to do the voices, and they were so thrilled.
Keith was told by Corey Burton that Jay had opened a shop called the Dudley Do-Right Emporium, a sort of merchandise shop that sold everything Jay wore, including hats, watches, cassette tapes, plush toys, shirts, cartoon scripts and original animation cells. Located at 8000 Sunset Boulevard, just a few yards from the main office, Jay and his wife frequently worked at the shop, and Skip Craig worked in a building behind it. The shop closed in 2005.
No, the Emporium was absolutely on the corner of Sunset.
Right. And then you were.
I was there behind it. Yeah, there was an alley, and then that house. But later on, what became his main office was 8218 Sunset, and that was only 3 doors along Sunset from the Emporium.
In the late 1970s, Bill was heavily involved in a ton of ASIFA events. ASIFA is a non-profit organisation which Bill founded back in 1957.
First time I saw him in an ASIFA setting was at one of the annual Annie Awards, where I was invited by Rick Reinert, who, unknown to the world, was destined to become the next president of ASIFA, but Bill was the president there, and he did the grand opening remarks of the ceremony, and it was such a swell event. Everybody, all the gentlemen or cartoonists, as you might call them, in tuxedos, and all the women looking, in their finest. Everybody looking great. June and Bill recommended me for the Academy, and I got on. By the time I joined the board, Bill was no longer there, but his influence remained. A lot of the things he put into place continue to this day.
Robert Stone met Bill back in July 1977. June Foray was the president of ASIFA at the time and had called Robert to her house to organise sales. It was there he first met Bill. When he became president of ASIFA, he assigned Robert to be his chief photographer. His photos were printed in the new ASIFA animation magazine and were greatly received. According to him, Bill Scott changed ASIFA.
During his tenure, he appointed Robert as the official photographer of it. Holy cow! Oh, that's great!
Bob Kurtz was on the executive board of ASIFA with Bill around 1977 to 1980. He described him as a great leader.
I remember Bill Scott as being, along with a lot of the other men of his age at that time, sort of a wary, cold warrior. In that, if you weren't on the right side of the union issues and things like that in the industry, he sort of took a dim view of you, you know.
So we started doing these ASIFA shows. Of course, we would meet before going up in front of the audience and doing these scripts, and Bill would direct them and assign the characters. That was, God, he was so kind to me. And then we'd do a little run through and then go out and perform it. And then afterwards, and between shows, because sometimes we would do 2 or 3. Come on, let's go have a drink. Let's go have a drink. Bill always. We'd go to the, in the shopping center or whatever, the bar, and he and June would have cocktails, and Bill would tell stories and talk about Jay and his adventures in Hollywood and his struggles with getting those shows on the air. And boy, what a hero, Bill Scott. Not just a genius as a writer, and a damn fine character voice actor.
Some families even use them as makeshift fireplaces.
Turn up the volume, dear. It's getting chilly in here.
Nevertheless, most people found they just couldn't get along without their television.
Come back. Please come back.
Bullwinkle, do you realize that right now, we're the only town in the whole world that isn't watching The Lone Ranger?
What's another show? Let me get Charlie's Angels.
Yeah.
Charlie's
Angels. Yeah.
Starsky and Hutch.
Yeah, got a pencil.
Three's Company.
Or Dallas.
Dallas.
Yeah,
Dallas
would be good.
Yeah.
Dallas, yeah.
It seemed that everyone in the animation industry got on well with Bill. Well, almost everyone. The only person to say anything negative about Bill was Paul Mayer. He had planned to put on a Rocky and Bullwinkle puppet show to entertain children at the Circus Hotel in Las Vegas. He had recorded the dialogue from the show on tape, and all he needed was permission. When he approached Bill and Jay to persuade them to sign over the rights, they refused, which caused a rift between them. Bill also worked on tributes to other actors, The Crazy World of Laurel and Hardy from 1965 and The Golden Age of Buster Keaton from 1975. He wrote the narration to these compilations of the original sketches performed by their respective actors.
We were watching Laurel and Hardy shorts on television. And my dad loved Laurel and Hardy, but I remember saying to me, how sad it was that all of their films were made before there was such a thing as residuals. So Laurel and Hardy would sit at home watching themselves on television and not making a dime from it, which unfortunately is also the way the things worked out with us, because all the really Jay and my dad wanted to do back when Rocky and Bullwinkle were being produced was get the damn thing on television. And so my dad had apparently no ownership interest in it at all. So all the Rocky and Bullwinkle things get shown, and we don't get a dime from it.
Bill and I did the whole thing. He picked out the stuff, the shots he wanted, and then we'd move stuff around a lot. He would take it by topics. One was, I think, hats and doors, but it was topical. It wasn't a group of shorts straight through. It was excerpts from a lot of things.
In 1977, to commemorate all he had done for the animation industry, Bill was awarded the Windsor Mckay Award at the Asifa Hollywood Banquet alongside the likes of Mel Blanc, Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera. It was 1980 and Jay Ward wanted to get back into action. They had 3 pilots produced: Rah Rah Woozy, Fang the Wonder Dog and Hawk Ear.
Fang the Wonder Dog, the takeoff on Lassie. Every time the family got in dire straits on Fang, he would come and destroy the situation. They were in much worse trouble than they were before he tried to save them. The Indians couldn't even attack with bows and arrows. They used birch bark whappers. Smack, 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 smack. And then Rah Rah Woozy was a college football takeoff. It was, "What's the matter, you?" But it was about the coaches, really. Weeby Eubanks and, I can't remember. I don't think it ever would have sold.
Fang and Hawk Ear had already been turned into actual pilots in 1971, and then Rah Rah Woozy was turned into one. Sadly, all 3 of them flopped. Bill was the voice of Maury Mouse. This would be one of the final things he did for Jay Ward Productions.
55, 56, 57 seconds flat. Nothing like a quick jog around the old maze to keep in shape, eh, Hamilton? Uh-huh. Now for a quick dip in the guppy tank, and what are you looking at?
We did a pilot on the Super Bowl, a boob on the Super Bowl called the Stupor Bowl, featuring Rocky and Bullwinkle and Boris and Natasha and Dudley. Those were the characters that we wanted to use from the show. And it was a pretty funny show. It was a good pilot and was very well received until, I guess, CBS checked with the National Football Conference. And they didn't think it was a good idea at all, particularly since we had personified the owners as being absolutely stupid and venal.
Also in the early 80s, a new set of entertainment centres began to roll out across America. Bullwinkle's Restaurants, a chain of family entertainment centres which included a sit-down restaurant complemented by arcade games, go-karts, laser tag, mini-golf and lots more. It was kind of like Chuck E. Cheese in a way. Of course, their namesake became the chain's official mascot. That wasn't all though. The company had animatronic shows too. They were built by AVG Technologies and were brought to life by June and Bill.
Heidi, you lovers of fine food and fabulous fun.
Bullwinkle, you a star of the Thanksgiving Day Parade?
Yeah, in New York City. Most years they got a great big balloon shaped just like me that floats above the parade.
Composed by Bill Broughton at his studio in Glendale, the soundtrack consisted of many songs and skits voiced by the original duo. Unfortunately, as the years went on, the restaurants diminished in number. As of 2021, there are only 3 Bullwinkle's restaurants still open in America, and only one of them, in Tukwila, has working animatronics, made by Dreamation and not AVG. There is a Boomers restaurant in New York City that has the full show, but it's currently not running. Frank Welker, one of the most highly regarded voice actors in showbiz, was good friends with Bill. I first met Bill Scott when I answered a call from my agent to attend an open audition for some radio spots featuring a chain of drive-through restaurants. The year escapes me, but suffice it to say it was many years ago and I was young in the business. I do remember being extremely excited and a little intimidated when I found out the drive-thrus were actually Bullwinkles. It was a ridiculously small chain and Bill would jokingly explain it made us very inclusive. Since Rocky Bullwinkle and their friends were Frank's absolute childhood favourites, he was beside himself. He recalled, "When I arrived, I shook hands with this courteous yet serious gentleman who asked me if I had ever seen the show. That took me off guard and made me chuckle and reply with, 'I nearly missed graduating high school cutting classes to get home and watch every episode.' He laughed good-naturedly, shook my hand and said he respected my priorities, then replied, 'Hi, I'm Bill Scott.' We had an instant bond." Frank's audition and enthusiasm for the job gained respect and the wonderful sound of laughter from his genius and idol, Bill Scott. They worked on and off the restaurant commercials. Bill would even choose Frank and a few others to be his successors. Well, I plan on doing Bullwinkle and Dudley for a while longer, but if I ever fire myself, I know who to call.
A few years later when I met him over there, I think it was like 1980, 81, and by then he knew that I could do all of these other voices, and other people had told him. He said, "You really got it." And he said, "Boy," he said, that's close." He said, when I go, he said, "Boy, you've inherited that voice and Dudley Do Right." And then I found out, just again from meeting people and hearing things through the grapevine, that he had also said the same thing to Frank Welker and to Joe Alaskey. So
Frank Welker would go on to work with Bill in a number of other cartoons, like Deck the Halls with Wacky Walls. Speaking of which, Bill's next role would be in that special, which was a Christmas special released in 1983 based on the Wacky Wool Walker toys.
Amazing, absolutely awe-inspiring. That's by far the brightest star I have ever seen. Wacky, we've been monitoring Earth. That star seems to have something to do with an event called Christmas.
This special starred many voice actors alongside Bill and Frank, including Daws Butler, Trez McNeil, Peter Cullen, and a young Scott Menville. It was written by Mark Evanier.
That was my first job voice directing. I wrote the script, and the network people said to me, "Who would you like to have voice directed? Because we need someone to come in and direct the voices, cast it." And they gave me a list of people who were available, and they were lousy people. There were people, the good people were all under contract someplace. They couldn't get them. So I said, "I can't do a worse job than these people. If you'll let me cast whoever I want, I'll direct it for free." So they said, "You got it." So that's why it has Daws Butler and Frank Welker and Bill Scott and Howard Morris and Peter Cullen and all those people in it. I cast people I wanted in it, and I called Bill, because I knew him a little bit, and said, "When was the last time you did a cartoon that wasn't for Jay Ward?" And he said, "I can't remember. I may never have done a cartoon that wasn't for Jay Ward." I said, "Well, can I hire you?" And he was delighted. After I got to know Bill, as I watched Jay Ward cartoons, I could hear his sense of humor even more. Once I'd met him, I realized how much he was influencing those cartoons.
Sadly, the special was unsuccessful and received low ratings. Bill voiced JB in Alvin and the Chipmunks and provided additional voices for the puppy's further adventures.
813 Running Brook Lane is sitting on the richest oil supply in the whole county. And I want it. Then steal it, Arlo. When JB wants something, he gets it. This is what you traveled over 500 miles to show me? A puppy dog? Tell me,
Have you ever seen a dog with ears the size of these?
In August 1984, Jay Ward and Bill Scott decided to close down Jay Ward Productions. By this time, they were only working on the Captain Crunch commercials, and Bill thought it was no fun anymore. He then went freelancing for his final years.
Jay wasn't even trying at that point. He would just hang around. By then, he took over the main office part in the Havenhurst building.
One day we were at a Gummy Bears session, and Bill was telling June and me that he got a phone call from Jay Ward, and Jay said, "Bill, you're doing all right, right? I mean, you're okay. The kids are through college and everything. Are you okay? Are you well set?" And he said, "Yeah, I guess I am." He said, "Okay, I'm glad to hear that, because I'm thinking of closing down the studio," and so that's what Jay Ward did. He just thought, well, it's been a great run, and we did all those shows, and then they made a lot of money for many years doing all those commercials. And it was so kind of surprisingly humdrum. There were no announcements in the trades or anything like that. It was just a couple of simple phone calls, and then we quietly fold up.
In a rare on-screen role, Bill made an appearance in the live-action comedy The Duck Factory, starring Jim Carrey, as the host of the Annie Awards. June Foray was also in this episode, alongside veteran voice actor Don Messick.
What about that, folks? That buddy sure could pick him, couldn't he? Moving right along, before we get to the awards categories, I've been asked to join our very own Alf Whedon and the Cartooners for a medley of some of your favorite cartoon theme songs.
I recently did a guest shot on a new live-action comedy series for CBS called The Duck Factory, and it is about a group of animators in a sleazy old studio in Hollywood. And I met the young cast of the Duck Factory on this location shoot, and the three young fellows who are the lead came up, threw their arms around me, and they said, "You were our babysitter. I grew up with you. You got me through high school." That's very gratifying, to realize that you've corrupted an entire generation, I suppose.
Alan Burns created the Duck Factory. His first writing job was to work for Jay Ward. And so basically his character is Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey is basically playing Alan Burns. They took the Duck Factory cast for the most part and introduced us to Bill, and also that day when we were doing the Annies, to June, and to, all the sort of that group. So we did get to meet, but it was an honor to meet him. Yes, definitely. Basically, it was just us, doing a fictional version of the Annie Awards. So yes, he was the host, he was the MC, and he did a wonderful job.
This wasn't his first time on stage, though. He was known for performing in theatre in Tahunga. Bill was a community person who always helped out.
He was more of a grandfather than my grandfather was. He was at my baptism, my christening, my confirmation, at my wedding.
We were talking to somebody, and somebody's asked to say, "Oh, you and you do Snidely Whiplash? Yeah, you do the Hans Conried characters and some Paul Frees characters." And Bill chimed in. He said, "Yeah. He secretly does all of my characters behind my back." And then he. I mean, oh God, he was so sweet. He said, "Better than me." And I didn't have an answer because it was true.
He lived on Valmont Street as his family moved to the neighbourhood in 1952. He used to direct plays at the Ascension Episcopal Church, the local community theatre were the Foothill Curtain Raisers.
I'm very active in my local church, where we have a drama group, and we do a number of plays there. I love to build sets, and I love to act. God knows I need to keep my hand in. So we do a great deal of work for and in the church, Episcopal Church.
He was always working on a production at the church. We went to several. I don't know if you ever saw.
I think I saw at least one.
And didn't he wrote some of them too?
No, I think it was existing stuff. They did Little Minor Sunshine. They did Gilbert and Sullivan.
Oh.
He was the Inspector General in Pirates of Penzance and did that Wild Patter song. He was excellent. Well, he was good at anything he put his mind to.
He was senior warden several times, worked on most committees, headed the Ascension Players as much as there was a head, and sang tenor in choir, which his son John eventually came to direct.
Bill ran the Acolytes. We were his possession. And he was a very scary taskmaster, and you didn't ever want to screw up. John Fortman and I were Acolytes. We were both in uniform, and our job was to go through the door and go around the altar, bow in, and then go around the altar again, and we each had lights. Well, the torch was about this long, and it had a curve at the top, a little thing to put things out. And the wick ran inside the tube. We lit mine. And by the time I got to the candles, the whole thing had caught on fire. I am standing with my back to about 100, 150 people, including Mr. Scott. I have little bits of wick dropping off, and I am nonchalantly trying to put them out before it sets fire to the carpet. We ran in the back and we put it out, and we were just standing there, and Bill Scott came up behind me. And it's just, because seriously, I just really did something bad according to what we do. And he looked at me and he said, Jackie, we're supposed to light the candles, not the church. And then he turned around and he walked away.
Barb and I grew up with theater happening all the time, both the Ascension Players and the local community theater. And my dad directed a lot of stuff. My mom directed a lot of stuff. It's sad. The last show I did for him was Fools, which is a Neil Simon play. That show is the first time I think he really respected my work as an actor. I played a guy who comes on, and my brother was the lead in it. He plays a young schoolmaster who comes to this Russian Jewish community as the teacher. And everybody there is stupid. And so he comes up to me and he says, what's your name? And I say, Snetsky. And he says, what's your first name? And I say, how soon do you need it? And he really liked my work on that. But he died during the production, and which was not a happy event.
Famous singer Weird Al Yankovic even asked Bill to lend his vocal cords to his cover of the George of the Jungle theme song.
I did a thing for Weird Al Yankovic, who is doing a new album, and he's doing the George of the Jungle theme as one of the cuts on it, and he wanted the authentic George of the Jungle cry. He called me, and I did a special session for Weird Al where I just yodeled,
George of the Jungle, strong as he can be.
It was just a very faithful cover version. It wasn't done silly, or it wasn't a polka version or a heavy metal version. It was meant to sound exactly like the original. And I brought in Bill to recreate his voice tracks for George. He was a sweet guy, and I wish I could have worked on more projects with him. I think that was, I think he probably passed not too long after we did that. That would have been 1985, I guess. He came into the studio for, I guess, like an hour. And I was amazed that he sounded exactly like he did on the original tracks. And we had the original tracks. We could have just used the original tracks, but I just thought it would be really cool to bring him in anyway and just recreate everything, which we did, and he was amazing.
Continuing with his freelancing work, around this time he had been hired by voice actor agent Don Pitts. He was also the voice of the Tug in the ABC weekend special The Velveteen Rabbit.
I can wait. Christmas comes too fast around here. I hate to have the new toys see me this way. I'm a wreck. He'll play with us tomorrow. He knows us better.
Another special he did was CBS Story Break's Harry the Fat Bear Spy, based on the book by Gahan Wilson.
Today's the day the spy master hands out the new assignments. Well, did you hear that there's something happening at the National Macaroon Factory? So, Murray, how do you like your noodles? I rather like mine with butter sauce.
Whilst he was freelancing from J Ward material, Bill would then come to Disney TV Animation to star in 2 of their cartoons, The Wuzzles and The Adventures of the Gummy Bears. The Wuzzles was a show where it was centred on mixed up animals, usually one with another. Bill voiced Moosel, the youngest of the Wuzzles. Half moose, half seal. This was his second time voicing a moose character following Bullwinkle.
Did you say raining? Maybe it's a storm. Could be there's a monster storm coming. My imagination. What do you call that? Over there.
He also provided the vocal effects for Crocosaur's minion, Bratz, too.
Here, you're just in time for lunch. Have a tuna pork roast.
I actually brought Bill in for a different part. I wanted him to play, what did I want him to play? No, I wanted him to play Rhinoki. Yeah, there was a certain voice Bill did that I wanted for Rhinoki. I cast a couple of the roles in that show, not all of them. But then I left the show. I wrote the pilot, the network bought it, and Bill wound up playing Moosel. And while they had him in doing Moosel one day, he auditioned for the Gummy Bears, which was done in the same building, same place, and he got a role on that also.
His co-star Brian Cummings also recalled his experience with Bill on recording The Wuzzles.
I think Bill having a great knowledge of the characters, having insights that only a writer would have. If you listen to his character work, it's fabulous. But any of us, Alan Oppenheimer, we played the 2 villains. And again, the seats are all set up around the perimeter of the room. So we all kind of looked at each other. So the subtleties, and I think if you listen to Bill's stuff, his characters were some of his characters were so mild, were so sweet and so soft that you didn't necessarily hear what he did in the session.
The Adventures of the Gummy Bears was created by Michael Eisner. The show was co-created by Jim Magan and Art Vitello.
Hi, my name is Jim Magan. I was a writer and story editor and show creator at Disney TV Animation, and I had the wonderful good fortune to work with Bill Scott on the first season of Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears. I'm talking to Bill, and I'm saying to him just how wonderful he is and how there were, a handful of things that really sort of molded me into the position I was in of creating cartoon shows and being funny and everything. And then I said, okay, I'll shut up. I'll shut up now. No more. And he's a sweet man. He had a cup of coffee, and he put his arm around me, and he said, Jim, something you need to learn in this business is you can never kill a cat by giving it too much cream. I said, okay, I'll keep giving you cream. That's fine.
The plotline of The Adventures of the Gummy Bears is about a clan of bears who live in Gummy Glen, and they drink gummy berry juice to give them the ability to bounce. The show starred many popular actors including Paul Winchell, Lorenzo Music, June Foray and of course Bill Scott. Bill voiced Gruffy Gummy, Toadwort and Sir Tuxford on the first series of the show.
I wonder where the others are. Who needs her? I'll go check on them by myself. Then stay out of my kitchen.
Tony really described his character.
I know get squash. I know get squash. I know.
Don't worry, lad. I'll be back. I think.
It was like being a brand new voiceover person, learning from the most famous voiceover person you could ever work with, pretty much, or the most listened to of my childhood. It was spectacular and very humbling.
We're in like dozens of episodes together. Yeah. Well, however many there were that year, we were all in every episode.
I didn't talk to him a lot. I mean, it would be just sort of, I think what happened is because other people would want to talk to him or something, I would sort of be on the periphery and listen and just sort of get to just hear whatever he was talking about.
Bill Scott is a lovable guy. Like he was fun and engaging, and he was really nice to me, and I was just an insignificant kid in his life, but he made me feel like I was worth it.
Gummy Bears would pair up June and Bill again since their Rocky and Bullwinkle debut. Grammy and Gruffy's relationship is varied. Some days they like each other, some days they don't, but together they help each other solve their problems.
I think I was 13, or 12 or 13, when I started recording the Gummy Bears sessions. And, you know, I knew because I was a big fan of television, I knew that I was there with other great actors. It was great. It was cool. We went into a big room, and there was five mics in a circle, in a semicircle, and it was all of the Gummy Bear voices and myself. We just had the scripts on our little music stands, and we just went through the script. Just watching those other characters or the other actors work for me was incredible. I mean, in between takes, they would cut into their famous characters like Tigger or Bullwinkle or Rocky or Boris and Natasha. All these famous cartoons that I grew up watching were all just standing right next to me.
Bill Scott just had a field day playing Toad. When they fling him with the catapult out into the forest, he's all by himself. And he's just wandering around. And he says, so embarrassing. He says, I'll show Dookie I'm going to be brave, and I'll do blah, blah, blah. And then he says, come to think of it, I think I'll just lie here and let the wolves eat me, And he had wrote in this whole soliloquy where he's talking to himself, how terrified he is. And it was so funny when Bill did it that we had to stop him and do a retake, because the people in the booth where the director sat, where I sat, we were the voice directors, and we had some NBC people in there, and we were laughing so hard it was bleeding through the glass into the recording booth, into the recording studio, and they were picking it up on the microphones. So, Bill was a funny guy.
I can do just fine without that old Dookie, all by myself in these woods, alone, lost. I want my Dookie. I'm gonna go home. This is the end. I haven't eaten in half an hour, and I'm starving. And now I fall down a cliff. I'll just have to lie here, helpless, until the wolves find me. Wolves! On second thought, I'll keep going.
Also, you got to remember, his character was always kind of like, he was such a naysayer. He was always sort of saying, oh, no, you can't do that. And, and so it's kind of funny because as my character, it's like, I'm very, I would be kind of the upstart, and wouldn't buy into it.
By this time, J. Ward Productions was long gone, but that was not the end for their characters. One Mountie was destined for the big screen. Frank Welker and Mark Evanier teamed up to make a Dudley Do-Right film. What do you think of you and I creating a live-action Dudley Do-Right full-length motion picture? Frank asked. Mark replied with, you had me at Dudley. Mark warned me that the rights would be a nightmare, but maybe Bill Scott would be interested in collaborating. Frank came up with the idea first after seeing Marius Wires in a film titled The Gods Must Be Crazy, and he thought he looked exactly like Dudley Do-Right.
Frank had the idea to hire that guy and make a live-action Dudley Do-Right movie with Bill dubbing in the voice.
The three of them had lunch at a famous deli near Farmers Market in Hollywood.
So we're sitting in a restaurant, Bill, Frank, and me, and they're talking about this, and Frank is doing Bullwinkle for Bill, and Bill is teaching him how to do the Bullwinkle voice. So I'm sitting in this elegant restaurant with red-jacketed waiters and nude lighting and such, with two men talking Bullwinkle. And the waiter comes up, and it's a French restaurant. The waiter says to Bill, sir, have you decided what you would like to have as your meal? And Bill, as Bullwinkle, says, well, I'll have this. I can't do Bullwinkle impression. But in the Bullwinkle voice, he does that. And the guy looks straight at him. He turns to Frank, and then Frank orders in the same voice, Bullwinkle. And they look at me, and I went like, hokey smokes,
Bill said yes to everything and loved the idea. I would love to work with you two, but be aware you will need Jay Ward's blessing. Can we eat her again tomorrow?
Frank had done Bullwinkle for something while Bill was still alive. There were these Bullwinkle restaurants. They did a couple of them. I think only one is left someplace. And they had figures of the characters with recordings in.
A studio had been organised, but unfortunately Bill passed on before any further production could be made, so the whole idea was tossed.
I was about 9 or 10 years old when Rocky and Bullwinkle came on TV. I actually met Bill Scott. It was just before he died. He and June Foray were doing a show. They were, coming to local cities and they would have an evening with Bill and June, and they would show, they showed an episode of the Metal Moon Munching Mice. And they showed a couple of short subjects that June Foray was in. And we did a live read. They went to radio stations and they picked the guy at each station who could do voices and brought them on stage with them that night. It was me and another guy, a voice guy who's now passed. His name was Joe Lasky. And it was at New England Life Hall in Boston, Massachusetts. And New England Life was an insurance company. But they had a big hall, and all of a sudden the place was packed with people because they knew that Bill and June were going to be there. I mean, there was all ages. They loved them.
Bill also did a personal appearance at a ball. They had this makeshift stage, and they were going to have him and a handful of other people recreate a Rocky and Bullwinkle script. And the place was packed. I mean, there were like parents with their kids, and they were blocking traffic. The whole place was full. So by the time I got there with my wife and a couple of kids, I don't know, we got there and we were way in the back. I mean, a long way from the stage. And Bill came out. Hi, ladies and gentlemen, how are you? It's great to see you. Blah 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 blah. And he looks up and he sees me. And I thought, well, that's weird because, we've only worked together on a few, Gummy Bear episodes. He sees me and he says, whoa, hold on. And he walks off stage and he comes back out. He says, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and Jim Magon and his family. And everybody looks around like, what?
Another thing Bill did in the mid-80s was a live ice-capade show called Ewoks on Ice, or Ewoks and the Magic Sunberries, made for Lucasfilms and Disney, based on the Star Wars Ewok creatures. This was a pre-orchestrated touring live ice skating event shown at various arenas. Unfortunately, no footage of the full show has surfaced online, aside from commercials and photos, but he is believed to have voiced a character called Chief Chirper. Hal Rail, who voice acted on the performance with him, recalled that Bill had the incredible agility to fascinate and control the mayhem. This was a posthumous role as he passed away when the ice show started touring in 1986. Bill Scott also voice directed once too.
So hi, my name is Andy Morris. I'm the chief engineer and owner of Buzzy's Recording in Los Angeles. Back in 1985, this guy called me up and said, hi, my name's Bill Scott, and Bill Melendez was the animator of all the Peanuts cartoons. Bill said to call you up because you're the guy. I've never directed before. So I'm saying to myself, this can't be the Bill Scott if he's never directed. This guy's written, he's animated, he's been a writer. So something's going, okay, it's got to be a different Bill. Okay. Anyway, so I need to record these 6 people. Just want to know what are the ropes. And I went through a bunch of suggestions and we agreed that we would do it all ensemble. And the lineup was going to be June Foray, Daws Butler, Janet Waldo, Will Ryan, and then we had Joe Alasky. This was Joe Alasky's very first union-paying session. Then we had one more participant, Bill's wife, Dorothy. I'm going, oh, shoot, Bill, I don't know. I've only got 6 microphones. What do I do? Kind of being a little rhetorical. And he goes, let the munchkins share. Meaning June Foray and Daws Butler, who are of short stature, would share the microphone, the munchkin. And at first I thought, what an insult. If anything, those guys should be having separate microphones and everybody else be sharing. But there was one key thing. Daws and June were veterans of the radio industry. Oh, by the way, there was one more person, Frank Welker. It was an educational animation that was being paid for by Standard Oil of Indiana. to teach economies like capitalism. I think it was focused on capitalism versus socialism. So it's called Return to Mocha, M-O-C-H-A.
I got to play the lead in it. And Bill said Bill told me, I was going to do this, but the character looks like you, so you may as well do it. So that's how I got on that.
Daws had just recovered from a stroke. He was very reluctant to work for anyone, but Bill Scott was one of his old dear friends, and he said, I'll do it. So Daws would sit down throughout the whole session until he had a line. So Bill would go, everybody hold. Okay, Daws, line 14 as Pablo. So that meant that Daws didn't have to say, where am I and what's my part? Bill was front-loading that in a very gentle way.
One of the final things he did voices for and wrote for was Molly and the Skywalkers' Happily Ever After, a bit like a darker version of Charles Schultz's Peanut specials. Released a month after the Gummy Bears and Wuzzles, he had a number of roles including a bus driver, a janitor, a ringmaster and 3 police officers.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, presenting direct from 6 years at the Plainview Elementary School, Miss Molly Conway and Ribbon the Wonder Dog.
Quiet back there!
What the devil are you kids doing? Hey! Hey!
Hey, that's the 10th time those kids have gone past.
Yeah. Hey, Tracy! Isn't that the little Conway kid?
Yeah. We had any calls about her? Not yet.
Yes?
Has anybody been looking for 2 little lost kids?
Yes. Those nice people over there.
What he didn't know is that this, along with Gummy Bears and Wuzzles, would be one of his final voice acting roles ever, as it all came to a halt in the fall of '85. On the 29th of November 1985, Bill Scott unexpectedly passed away from a heart attack over the Thanksgiving weekend. He was 65 years old.
Apparently he indulged wine, cigars, and food. He woke up in the middle of the night. I guess it woke Dorothy up. He clutched his chest and he fell to the floor, dead. It was that quick. He was alive and then he was dead in a split second. Rob came tearing in. I guess Dorothy screamed. She called 911 and Rob just started CPR and he tried to bring him back and he was gone. It was that fast.
Bullwinkle Moose was sadly no more.
Bill Scott is dead. He was the man who wrote and delivered the words of the people and animals whose exploits shaped a generation. Bill Scott died over the weekend at his home in Tahunga, California. Bill Scott was 65 years old. We'll miss him.
Barbara was not in the area at the time. Tina and I were living together in Van Nuys. We hadn't gotten married yet, but we were living together in Van Nuys. We got a call that he'd been taken to the hospital. And when we got to the hospital, my mom and Rob were there, and my mom said that he died. He was only fucking 65.
June called me that he had died.
It still seems so tragically unfair because he was so smart and he was so funny. He was such a good writer and he was a good artist, of course, too. And he was such a nice guy, too, and good taste. And to die that early was just terrible.
Lloyd Turner, who had came to Jay Ward from Warner Brothers, was at the studio one morning, and Jay came in looking very shocked. He looked at Lloyd and said, "Master Scott is gone."
Yeah, I went out to the house maybe a couple of weeks after Bill died, and I'd just been there like the week before he died. And Dorothy was packing up and stuff, and there was a stack of comic books, maybe about that high. I said, what are these comic books all about? And she said, well, when he was blacklisted, he started writing for comic books. And I said, blacklisted? I never knew that. I had never realized Bill had been blacklisted. And that had never come up or been mentioned.
After his passing, the Ascension players died down as Dorothy didn't have the strength to continue. He was in the middle of directing the production Fools for the community church when his death happened.
Bill loved to do local theater, and he directed a play called Fools that was written by Neil Simon. And he said to Art Vitello and I, just directed this play. I would love you guys to come see it. So we went, we watched the show. It was very funny. We congratulated him. It was like, wow, that's cool. And this was, if I'm not mistaken, the last time I saw Bill.
He had a production of the Neil Simon play God's Favorite that he had directed. And he invited Frank and myself to go to the first performance. And I couldn't go, so Frank went. And at the end of the show, Bill's family came out and said, we are doing this in tribute to our father who died yesterday, or day before. In the last couple of days, Bill had directed the production, and then he passed away, and they felt the show had to go on in his honor, so they did the show. And Frank called me from his car phone as he was driving home, just in tears, devastated, and I was very upset about it too.
Last time I remember seeing Bill, I'm sure I saw him afterwards. I know after I had Brittany, he came over to check what color eyes she had. Then he said something like, not a bad job. And then he walked off. But what I remember is we were at a party in Altadena. It was a church party. I had to have been standing. I couldn't have been sitting because Bill was standing about 15, 20 feet away from me. I think he was standing by the bar. And he looked at me and he went, and I went, and he just burst out laughing. And he says, no, you, get over here. And that's my last memory of Bill.
It wasn't just the community of Tujunga who were saddened by his death. His voiceover friends were too.
See, Bill Scott, to me, was one of the most talented actors in town. Great sense of dialect, characterizations, the top of his voice, the bottom of his voice, inventive ideas. I had a tremendous respect for him as an actor, and June, a wonderful actress. And it was like we fed each other. We loved to work together. It was like a romance. And to read a script for the first time, the cold readings should have been recorded. But I just like to give credit to him from the way I feel, because I always had a tremendous respect for him as a person, as a friend, and as a terrific actor, and comedian, and writer. So he had it all. And we miss him very much.
We were all deeply affected by the loss of this brilliant man that everybody waited so long for him to come back because he was a force.
I remember just being shocked. Like I couldn't believe it. I just felt really grateful that I had been able to work with him and learn from him.
Then I went out to his funeral, which was a very funny funeral. June gave a lovely speech, and Bill Conrad, I think he was there, and I can't remember who else was there, but all the animators were there. Welker was there.
Still, it was a pretty large church, and the thing was practically full. And most of us in the business were either towards the middle or towards the back. Friends and family were towards the front and everything. But again, it was a pretty large church. I was surprised to see a lot of people there that I would have not expected there. But Bill Scott was pretty well revered. It was a celebration of his life. You know, his family was there, and of course they were grieving. But at the same time, they wanted to share the wonderful things about their dad. And at the end of the service, Katie Lane and Frank Welker and I were walking back to the parking lot. And Frank said, you know, Andy, I used to think there was only one animation director. He was meaning Gordon Hunt from Hanna-Barbera, because I realized there were two.
A number of people, I should say, spoke very well. And I was really impressed by his kids, his family. You know, I already knew Dorothy, but the kids just were smart, just like Bill and Dorothy were. But I was surprised to see Frank there, because I had no idea that he even knew Bill. And I said, gee, Frank, wow, did you know Bill? And he said, yeah, we were working on a Dudley Do-Right movie together. We were writing it.
In the words of Frank Welker, Bill Scott was an intellectual, a comedy genius, a wit, a creative soul with that perfect bit of mischief. The day we lost him was a sad day for all of us who like to laugh.
He was a sweet,
guy, and I wish I could have worked on more projects with him.
Part of when I decided that I was really going for this, I sought to meet all of my heroes. I would have loved to meet Bill. It would have been a highlight of my life and career.
I will say that the biggest character, because I was doing my homework and thinking about this, the one character that would be my homage, my tribute to Bill Scott would be Cheese from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, because that was just me sort of talking like this, but it was the delivery.
Goofy's a little more guttural. To squeeze the voice, for Bullwinkle, you kind of have a different cadence. Gosh, we're Goofy. He has kind of the same kind of cadence. It's up and down, but it's a little bit farther back in the throat.
He was a really nice guy. He didn't make people uncomfortable or nasty or anything like that. But I know that because of who he was invited to go to jury boards, to view films and vote on who made the best film kind of thing. And he says, Jim, I've been to so many of these high school and college film festivals. I just want to grab these people and sit them down and say, you have to make 1 minute of animation. Go.
After his death, Corey Burton took over as the voice of Gruffy and Toady, and Roger C. Carmel took over as the voice of Sir Tuxford in Gummy Bears. However, Roger passed over a year later and was then replaced by Brian Cummings.
The big panic was he had 3 parts of the show. He had to recast all 3 parts for the next season.
I ended up, when Bill passed, I was carried on Gruffy Gummy, and I got to know Skip Craig quite well over the years. I haven't talked to him in a long time.
He did them so well that I played a track for Jay, and he said, "That's Bill." He said, "It's eerie. That's Bill." Corey was that good a voice man, or is, I shouldn't say was. I imagine he's still doing stuff.
Keith Scott took over as the voice of Bullwinkle and Fearless Leader.
Good evening, America. Bullwinkle Muth here saying, forgot my line.
We were wondering, how would you like to produce the Rocky and Bullwinkle movie?
I came home late from a TV thing that I'd been doing at night, and with the time difference, we only had heard that late that evening that he'd passed away. He said it's not good news, but he said, unfortunately, one of our favourite people, Bill Scott, just died very suddenly today.
However, Mr. Scott lives on in spirit. Since his death, there have been multiple remakes of his and Jay's shows, including a George of the Jungle film, a Rocky and Bullwinkle film with June Foray reprising her role as Rocky, and even another fractured fairy tale called The Fox, the Box and the Locks, which was created from an unused script of his.
Yeah, I felt I was just kind of like pinching myself. I couldn't believe it. Working with DreamWorks and to be, trying to fill the shoes of Bill Scott, it was really thrilling. It's just so unique and it's so specific to the character that anybody who was coming to the movie, I think, wouldn't want it to be completely different.
I mean, he's an iconic voice actor. He deserves a lot of cred for the work he's done over the years, and certainly one of my all-time favorites. So and such an honor to actually be able to work with him. So yeah, he deserves all the documentaries you can throw his way.
Rocky and Bullwinkle, I think, changed my life. It changed my way of thinking. It introduced me to dry, smart comedy that was also so silly. It introduced me to animated characters that could be of any species. Write me a show about a moose and squirrel, I believe, is the instruction that was given to Bill by Jay Ward, and off they went.
So, how have Rocky and Bullwinkle and their friends stood the test of time?
Do you think we'll ever see its like again?
I hoped so.
I still hope so, I guess. I thought that when we did the Bullwinkle show that we were doing something which was going to lead the way to a different kind of humor, a different kind of use of animation.
I think it was so tongue-in-cheek, subversive back then that the comedy was really quick and smart and adult. And I think for that reason it would hold up very well, because you can't fool people now. We're so educated about animation and about jokes and about comedy, but their one-liners were so good.
It seems to me that it stood the test of time just because it's kind of the same jokes. They're playing it pretty well. I think that one of the problems with shows that are that old is really keeping the attention span of younger people who are used to really high-quality animation and high-quality sound. And on some of those shows, it's a little scratchy and old, and it's tough for them to get their heads around. For us older people, I love that.
But I have heard producers and directors whom I respect all say the same thing. The doors are always open to somebody who comes in with an excellent portfolio and who shows not only a good drafting sense, but a good sense of staging and a good sense of humor. I give this advice not only to artists, but I constantly give it to people who are interested in doing voices and making tapes. I always tell them, make them funny.
Well, that's it for this tape. Thanks very much for sticking with it this far. You are now free to return to whatever trivial pursuit you were engaged in before it began. And I'll do the same.
Bill Scott was not just a voice actor. He was a terrific writer, father, husband, son, producer, entertainer, and moose. He may be gone, but his legacy lives on.
If I could be anyone in the world, I'd be happy to be Bullwinkle. I walk around so happy and so loose. Oh, it must be fun to be a talking moose. If I could be anyone in the world, there'd be no brighter star to twinkle. Oh, if I could be anyone in the world, I'd